Here we go. Hello, everybody. This is Steven Travers, and I'm with our guest, Bill Dwyre. This is still another episode of 100 Yards of Football, but it's still baseball season, and so we discuss other sports, and particularly baseball during the baseball season. Football's coming up. And this is my episode, which takes place every Thursday, roughly from 10:30 till about 12:15 Pacific time on the West Coast. It's called Take 5 with Steven Travers. This show is usually hosted by my partner, Harper LaBelle, 11-year veteran of the National Football League. Harper has some family issues today, so he's not going to be able to do it. And this is the brainchild of Mr. Vincent Turner, who's been doing this for a number of years. And I thank him so much for inviting me to come on. And so what I specialize in, I would say, is nostalgia, taking us back, not from Patrick Mahomes versus Tom Brady or the latest odds on the Super Bowl, but American and world sports history. And that's what we're going to discuss today with Mr. Bill Dwyre. And just as a little bit of introduction, Bill is one of the great sports editors of all time. He was with, help me out again, the Milwaukee Journal. Milwaukee Journal. And then the legendary Los Angeles Times. And he was the sports editor during the period in which the great Jim Murray, who was probably the finest sports writer who ever graced the pages of sports pages in the U.S., was his number one guy, and Bill edited him to the extent that there was an editor. He's told me in the past, because I've gotten to know Bill. Let me just quickly talk about how I got to know Bill. In 1999 and 2000, I was at the end of a 7-year period of writing screenplays, and a little bit of success, sold a few scripts, but it was a tough business. And I was kind of realized I wanted to get into my bailiwick, which is sports and sports writing. So I was writing high school sports for the Los Angeles Times and also for the LA Daily News, and also doing some sports writing, covering local high school for the Easy Reader, which was a little newspaper down in Hermosa Beach. So I guess you could say Bill was my editor, although he certainly wasn't editing high school sports. My guy actually was Gary Klein, who was a fellow USC Trojan. And it was also during this time, 99, we're going up to the millennium year of 2000. And the LA Times was in the process of doing a lot of memories of the 20th century, the Dodgers, the Rams, the Trojans, UCLA, Lakers, everything. And I put together a all-time Southern California all-star team, greatest athletes in the history of SoCal baseball, basketball, football, and track. And I submitted it to Bill, and he ran a little bit of it in that Millennium issue in 2000. The whole thing was actually published in Street Zebra magazine, which was a magazine I got hired to write for. And it actually got some attention, and I was on Fox Sports West with the great Jim Watson. But that's how I got to meet Bill. And then in around 2000, 2011 or 12, I interviewed Bill extensively for a book I wrote called The Poet, The Life in Los Angeles Times of Jim Murray. So we got to know each other quite well. I'd say we became friends, and so there it is. And so I want to welcome you, Bill, to Take 5 with Steven Travers.
Thank you, Steven. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. So where are you these days? Tell us what you're doing. What's the life like for Bill Dwyre today?
Well, I live in Baltimore now, of all places. I moved 2 years ago. My daughter and my grandchildren are here, so it seemed to make the most sense to move here. It was a little shocking to leave Southern California. I didn't realize how shocking it would be until I got here. But Maryland's nice. I see a lot of my family. I'm still doing some work for the Los Angeles Times, writing a couple of stories, maybe once every 6 weeks for the sports section, and in that way, keeping my hand in a little bit. But I'm pretty much retired. I'm 81 years old, and you do slow down.
Yeah, well, it's true. Yeah, I've noticed that because I do read the LA Times online, and I've seen your name pop up here and there. Usually some nostalgia piece or opinion.
Right.
And I've seen that for many years, in which after you were no longer the sports editor, but you were still writing for the Times. You were still very active for them.
Yeah, I did a kind of a 9.5-year stint right up until 2015 of being a general columnist. Plashke and I were the columnists.
Yeah.
It was, Stephen, I got to tell you, it was one of the more enjoyable times in my whole professional career. I loved doing it. I loved being the sports editor, but to get out and interview people and, be side by side with some of the people I'd hired and competing with them and writing stories on deadline, that was a real boost for me. I'm so glad I did it before I went off into the distance.
Okay, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to start with, where you were from and where you went to college. But there's one story you told me right off the bat as a headline, and it's one of the best stories that anybody has ever told me. I don't know if can you guess what I'm going to ask you?
No, I can't.
Okay, this was a beautiful story. So you're sports editor of the LA Times. It's 1986, and this is arguably the absolute height of the LA Times, and it's really the height of sports in Los Angeles. The Olympics had been held there in 1984, and in January of 1987, the Super Bowl was held at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. This is the Denver Broncos of John Elway versus Bill Parcells and the New York Giants. It's at the Rose Bowl, and you had a full parcel of highly talented sports writers at your disposal. Otis Chandler was the owner and publisher of the paper. He gave you full reign and really, I want to almost say an open checkbook. You might argue that, but you certainly
gave me an open checkbook and all expenses, and I exceeded it.
Okay. So that's where I'm going with this story, because I love this story. I've told this to many people. So you got Jim Murray, you got Mel Florence, you got, I think Scott Ostler was a young top writer for you, and you got all these wonderful writers. And you decide you're going to hire a non-sports writer to go into the press box, and he's not even an American, but he's going to be there and he's going to see what the Super Bowl is, the pageantry, the glory. And he is going to describe it. And the man's name was Leon Uris, and he was the author of a great novel called Exodus, which was the story of the creation of Israel. It was later made into a movie. And he's this well-known, fabulous novelist, and he was really well-known at that time. You hire him to sit in the press box. Tell me what happened.
Well, I hired him to do 2 stories. He stayed in Newport Beach, and he did one story kind of in advance of the game. He lived in Denver, so he was a little bit of a Bronco fan, and so that made this a little easier for him. He wrote a good advance story for us, very scholarly story. We got to the game, and I sat him in the press box in the Rose Bowl next to Jim Murray, and on the other side was Jack Smith, who was a news site columnist of great fame at the Los Angeles Times.
Sure.
And I had 9 or 10 other people there, because those were the days where the Los Angeles Times was overdoing everything in sports. My fault. And I didn't pay much attention. I just, I knew Murray would write what he wanted to, and Jack Smith would write what he wanted to. And I gave Leon the mandate to just feel it and write it. So the game ends. I'm running around making sure the copy is getting in, and I see Jim Murray kind of wrap up, and I see Jack Smith just finishing up, and I suddenly realized that I think the desk called me and said, "We got everything but Leon Uris. I'm paying this guy 10 grand to do 2 stories." So, I'm a little hoping this is going to be really good, worth my money. So I go to Leon Uris and I stand over his shoulder and I realize that the press box is pretty late. The press box is pretty cleaned out. And I say, "Leon, is everything all right?" And I look at his screen, his computer screen, and he's got about 3 paragraphs done. And I said, "Leon, is everything all right? Can I help you?" And he said, "Do you know what you did to me, you SOB?" And he started cursing me. And he went on and on and on. And I said, "Leon, I don't get it. What's the matter?" And he said, "You sit me next to Jim Murray. I sit here and watch a game. I look at his screen. He goes downstairs, interviews a couple of people. He comes back, and in 20 minutes to half an hour, he writes this incredible poetry. And I'm just shell-shocked. Do you know how long it takes me to write one of my books? Years and years. This guy in 45 minutes wrote a classic column. And I've had it. I can't do it. To hell with you." And he packed up his stuff and left the press box.
Yeah.
So I call the desk and I say, "What do you want me to do?" And they said, "I don't know what should I do." I said, "I will finish his story." So I finished Leon Uris' story somehow. About 8 more paragraphs, sent it in under the byline of Leon Uris, and that was the way it went. He was so intimidated by sitting next to Jim Murray. Jim never knew. Jim treated him like, a real hero. And I remember sitting in the press box and everybody was gone, and I just filed this Leon Uris / Bill Dwyre story, and thinking, "You don't get yourself into this again, Dwyer. Be a little smarter."
Yeah, you thought it would be something like outlined against the foggy shadow of the Wehrmacht. The entrance to the Rose Bowl field parted like the Red Sea as the Denver Broncos entered the green plains of the Rose Bowl.
And he froze. He just froze, and Murray just destroyed him.
Okay, how about that piece that he submitted from? Was he in Newport because one of the teams was training down there?
I'm sorry, here again?
You said he lived in Newport Beach. Was one of the teams training down there, like at UC Irvine or someplace?
No, he lived in Denver. Sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. He lived in Denver, and so he was a Bronco fan. He just stayed in Newport Beach and produced the first article from there. It was a pretty good article. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was a little bit of a fan of the Denver Broncos, and so when they lost, he was further upset, and that added to the whole thing of Jim Murray.
Yeah, well, they got killed.
Yeah,
that was, I think, the first of John Elway's 3 or 4 Super Bowl loss. Can you remember anything about what he did write in that first article?
I cannot. I think it was color about the Broncos, and it was, a great writer can write great things, and it was. I don't remember the specifics anymore. I suppose we could Google that. I hadn't thought about doing that, but he just built the pregame scene. That's all, and it was very nice.
Right, Leon Uris. Yeah, I know. I remember you telling me that story, and I could just see Jim Murray just. I don't know whether he was on a typewriter. I guess he probably had a computer screen at that point. Of course, Murray at this particular time is also dealing with the fact that he's basically blind. So he had these big Coke bottle glasses, and how he even saw the screen and could do. I don't even think he could. Could he even read his own copy at this point?
He could, Stephen, but we were very protective of him. I remember year after year, I'd go to the Rose Bowl with him. He loved the Rose Bowl game. Of
course.
And I invariably, you'd get there a couple of hours ahead of time, and there'd be every young sports writer from Keokuk, Iowa, and wherever, wanting to meet Jim Murray. And one of Jim's fears was that he would be approached and he'd turn his head too quickly, and the attached retina would unattach. He had one good eye and the other was kind of sketchy. And so I remember many times standing on his right side, I think it was, so that they'd have to approach on the left side so he wouldn't turn his head. And he took time with everybody and he talked to everybody, you know, and these young people would just worship him. And he'd give them advice, and he, you know, he loved it, but he was just, his time was good with everybody. But I stood there for a long time, many Rose Bowl, pre-Rose Bowl games, making sure that they would approach from the other side so he wouldn't turn his head and detach that retina again.
I've written a lot of different things for a lot of different organizations, and one of the most commented on things that I ever wrote was a lot of my friends read a letter that I wrote to the LA Times when Murray passed away in 1998, and all my USC friends, hey, I read your article in the Times, because they were all reading everything that the LA Times had that day, because it was a Jim Murray issue, and it included this art. I think I wrote, you know, I think I quoted him from a 1970. This is before you were his editor, but in 74, he wrote something along these lines. It wasn't a football game at the Coliseum. It was Patton's army on the march. It was the Wehrmacht in Poland in 1939. And you know, he was describing the Trojans destroying Notre Dame. Oh my gosh, alma mater, in that 55-24 victory. In fact, Harper, who's my partner on this show, he's not here today. He was 9 years old. He was at that game as a kid growing up. In fact, he went to Notre Dame High School in Sherman Oaks. But he was a Trojan fan. He's always made it clear that that's who he rooted for. And he was there, and I saw it on television. And that might have been, I don't know if it was the first time I ever read Jim Murray. I can tell you the first time I ever read the LA Times, I was 12 years old, and we were in, I want to say there's a place called Independence Lake or Lone Pine. It's on the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains, probably an hour from Mammoth. And so the LA Times was delivered to this place, and my dad would get it. And, you know, I'm looking at it, and I'd never seen a newspaper look like this before. It just had complete coverage of the entire major league scene. It had an article about Tom Seaver, who was my guy. So that really caught my eye. And it had this, I can't remember what Murray's column was, but it was something from it was 1971, and it was a great year in sports, and it was the middle of the summer, and I just go, holy cow. And I just became enamored with the LA Times then and there. And I would get that paper every chance I could. And as soon as I moved to Los Angeles, I immediately subscribed to it, and really have ever since. But Bill, I want to start, let's go back to the beginning. Where are you from?
I am from a place called Sheboygan, Wisconsin, directly north of Milwaukee, about 60 miles.
Yeah, that's the old Midwest League. I played in that league or Madison, Wisconsin, when I was the minor leagues with the Oakland A's. So I'm fairly familiar, and actually have spent some time on the Great Lakes just in recent years. I was at Notre Dame USC game, and I was at Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and I went to a Buffalo Bills game. So I become kind of a student of the Great Lakes, learning how the Great Lakes were formed, and unbelievable, like an iceberg that took a couple million years to move from Sweden to the Canada-US border, and then melted and formed the Great Lakes.
It's a nice part of the world until November.
Well, you know, you mentioned that you're in Baltimore now, so I'm sure it's hot and humid. It's going to get cold. And my daughter now lives in Vermont, and I just bought a piece of property. So I'm going to be in Vermont through Christmas. So we'll see how this Californian handles that. But okay, so where'd you go to high school? What did you do? Did you play sports? Were you a writer for the local paper or the student newspaper?
I was a quarterback on the football team at Sheboygan North High School. We didn't win a lot of games, but we enjoyed playing. I was a shooting guard on the basketball team. I was all-state third team in Wisconsin. And I ran track. I was a hurdler, hurdled on the same North team as a young man named Bill Gensler, who was state champion in the highs and lows, I believe. And I remember very specifically that before each hurdle race, before we got down on the blocks, Gensler would always say to me, "Be sure to get second place." Frequently. And I went on from there to the University of Notre Dame.
So this reminds me, I recently read a book. Rocky Bleier wrote a book some years ago, and he was from Wisconsin. So did you know Rocky Bleier, compete with or against Rocky Bleier, and did you know him at Notre Dame?
I did not compete. He was a little bit younger than I was. I do know him because I had a publishing firm, a publishing business for a few years after I retired. And one of the books we did was a book on Notre Dame. And one of the people we interviewed was Rocky, and he was great. Rocky is a great guy. So I got to know him a little bit. I've talked to him on the phone a couple of times, but our college careers did not intersect.
Okay, so when did you enter Notre Dame?
1962.
Okay, 1962. This is, I believe, the Terry Brennan era, if I recall.
No. It was Hugh DeVore and then Kuharich, Joe Kuharich. It was a down time for Notre Dame until my junior year, and then Air Parsegian showed up, I think, Stephen, in 1964, and everything turned around.
Everything turned around. The era began. Did you write for the newspaper at Notre Dame?
I was one of about 3 people who started a daily newspaper there. It was called The Voice, or maybe that's what they call it now. They had a magazine called The Scholastic, a monthly magazine, and it was beautifully done, and the sports writing was beautifully done, but there was very little opportunity for anybody else. And so we started this newspaper. I can't remember the name of it now. I think it's The Voice. It's either that now or it was then. And it was good. It was, a student newspaper, not without many flaws, but I got into it right away. One of my moments at Notre Dame was going to enrolling in a class called Writing Short Fiction with a very prominent professor named Richard Sullivan. And in that class was a guy named Sam Anson, who became editor of LA Magazine and who actually was, I think, captured in Vietnam. He was quite a journalist. Don Ohlmeyer was in that class. Barry Lopez, who has written dozens of books, and the whole deal was there were only 6 or 7 of us in that class, and the whole deal was that the professor said you have to write a short story, short fiction, not a fiction story, just a short story, and try to sell it. And if you sell it, your grade will be higher than the normal grade from what you get from this class. And I wrote a story about fishing with my grandfather in the Kettle Moraine area of Wisconsin in a big old trout fishing hole. And I caught a big trout, and we were way in the back where nobody could even know that there was water there. And I remember my grandfather telling me once it was probably like a 6-pound brook trout. It was incredible. I have since never caught a fish that big. And he looked at me and he said, this fish belongs here. We're not going to take it. We put it back in. So I wrote about that and sold that for Boys Life magazine or something. And that was a highlight of my career for a while, for a long while, actually. The other guys didn't sell anything. Ohlmeyer, who became an executive producer, they didn't sell anything at that time. So now they have all sold books and screenplays and things like that. But it was a fond memory of getting a great class at Notre Dame, and it kind of propelled me to different things, including a lot of writing things.
And I you and I have, Logan, is there something going on with the sound? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Maybe you could help with that. Oh, looks like you took care of it in real time. You did what I asked prior. You did what I asked prior to me asking you to do it. Okay, so we're back in business with Blue Star with Bill Murray, the great Bill Dwyre. And what I was going to say, Bill, is that you and I have a lot in common. I was an athlete before I was a writer, and I was not allowed to write for my high school newspaper, mainly because I took a journalism class, and the teacher didn't like me because I was always cutting up and joking with my friend Brad Cole. And Brad was a photographer, so she said, I'll take one of you, but not both of you. And Brad was the photographer. Said, Brad's going to be a photographer, but Steve, you're not going to be on the. It was called the Redwood Bark. Oddly enough, I came back and spoke to them in 2010 after having written 30 books, and told them, well, I've written 30 books, but I couldn't make the Bark. What I did the same thing that you did. I started my own newspaper. I called it the Redwood Sporting Green because we had green paper, and I printed it on green paper in this, had a typewriter and a mimeograph copy machine, and distributed it to my friends. And so that's really, and then you mentioned a great class in college. I took several courses in the screenwriting, or I should say in the cinema school at USC, including a screenwriting class. And I didn't write about fishing, although I had grown up fishing like you with my dad. I was, that was a big thing in the Travers family. But in this case, I wrote about this bar, the sports bar that we all hung out at USC, and the hijinks that went on there. And I turned it into a screenplay. It got an A, and we would all sit around in this sports bar drinking beer, reading from my screenplay. So that created a lot of interest. Okay, so tell me about some of your memories of Notre Dame. You're there when Ara Parseghian gets there. Obviously, a great football season in '64. You guys are unbeaten until you play the Trojans at the end of the year. Obviously, USC was and continues to be the big rivalry of the Fighting Irish. How did you feel about the Trojans in those days?
Hated them. Let me give you an example. I think it was a '64 game. Craig Fertig to Rod Sherman, would that be '64?
That is correct.
Yeah.
Most of
and I'm watching this game, and I think it was the game in the Coliseum where I learned that you don't expect to get any help in the Coliseum if you're Notre Dame. Notre Dame went ahead 17-0 at the half, and came out, and USC put on a great battle in the second half. And right near the end, it was like 20 seconds left or something, and Fertig sent Sherman on the left side down and out, and a guy named Tony Carey. I should not remember these names. It's not fair, but I do.
I remember.
Tony Carey was a defensive back, a great defensive back. I think he became a lawyer in Chicago. Slipped, fell down. Fertig hit Sherman. They went in and won the game, 21-17. And I never forgot that. When I got to LA, I met both of these guys, and we, for a while, had a standing bet. Fertig, particularly Fertig, on the Notre Dame USC game, and they loved to see me coming because they would replay that game every time. There was. I'll tell you this, Stephen. When I got the job as sports editor of the Los Angeles Times, 1981, I've told this story before. They put a little item in the paper. It said Bill Dwyre is replacing Bill Shirley as sports editor, and 4 or 5 paragraphs, and one of the sentences said he's a 19 '66, graduate of the University of Notre Dame. Well, the next day I'm sitting at my desk and the letters start pouring in. This is before email. This is before any of that. There are people having them hand delivered, and they all said the same thing. We're watching you, kid. We do not like the fact that a fighting Irish guy is sitting in the chair of the sports editor of the LA Times. And it was, I think I remember counting, there were 53 letters the next day after the announcement. And I was a sports editor of the LA Times for 25 years, and I wrote columns for another 10 years before I retired. And that never eased off much. I'd write something and they'd see some element of pro Notre Dame in it, and I'd get 7 or 8 letters and phone calls. So it was delightful. I loved it. But the Trojans were very aware of who was the sports editor of the LA Times, and it was very important to them. They kept a real tight watch on me at all times.
Well, I was at USC when you started in as the sports editor in '81. So, I was reading that paper very closely, but I don't ever remember seeing any bias on anything you wrote, or if anything, it was a golden era. Trojans. If anything, I thought the paper was, I don't want to say pro-Trojan or a Trojan celebration, but USC was so good in so many sports during that era that it really seemed like that. Certainly you look back at the headline after the 72 USC Notre Dame game. It says Davis, 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 Davis. There were things that you couldn't help. But let me ask you, when you were at Notre Dame, did you ever make the trip to Los Angeles to see the game against the Trojans?
I did not. I was on the sports staff, but there was not that kind of budget for us to cover games like that. And we did not. We just covered the home games in person.
Were you at the 1966 game at the Coliseum?
I was not.
But I'm sure you recall that this was quite the payback for 1964. It was a 51-0 Notre Dame victory that secured a national title for ERA. The one he was hoping to win in '64, he won in 1966. It's interesting to note, I know you weren't there yet, but that 1966 season was largely influenced by Jim Murray. Because it came down to the end of the season, and the Alabama Crimson Tide, which was still all white, was unbeaten, untied, and won. It was either the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl. I think they had the great Ken Stabler. And Notre Dame had tied Michigan State in the last game of the regular season, and neither one went to a bowl game, oddly enough. And the Associated Press gave they gave Notre Dame the national title even before the bowls. And Murray had written an article that excoriated Alabama, saying not only are they completely segregated, they only play segregated teams. And this was the moment, I think, for Bear Bryant where he decides, I'm going to have to do something. And it results largely 4 years later in him playing in the 1970 USC-Alabama game. Now, this is a game that's very near and dear to my heart. It was a book I wrote. We're actually still trying to make a movie out of it. Do you remember that 1970 USC-Alabama game? I know you weren't yet at the Times, but do you have any recollection of that and what it meant?
I do vaguely, but I do want to not let the opportunity pass without remembering after the Notre Dame reverse victory, 51-0, the great quote that Murray got John McKay to say. He said, Murray said that he watched the players, USC players, come into the locker room, and John McKay had just been beaten 51-0, and John McKay said, in only John McKay's wry sense of humor, all right, take a shower if any of you need one. I love that.
Yeah. Like we're trailing 35-0, and two math majors raised their hand.
Yeah.
You know, I had, gosh, you had a chance to know McKay. I interviewed him once. I know his son quite well, but I talked to a lot of his players, and gosh, what a sense of humor. He and Murray and Craig Fertig. I can imagine those three guys sitting around at Julie's just after a practice or after a game, you know, sipping a little bit of Irish whiskey. And,
I was there several times, and the butt of all their jokes, you know, and
yeah,
the
Notre Dame.
part of my introduction to Los Angeles was Julie's and John McKay, and those are memories, Stephen. You can't imagine, you can't revisit.
Well, okay. Speaking of, because you mentioned Craig Fertig, and gosh darn, I just loved Craig Fertig. In a very short period of time, we became really good friends. And I think that's just the way Craig was. When you knew Craig Fertig, you became, everybody I knew who knew Craig Fertig. Oh yeah, he was a friend of mine. I love Craig Fertig. We got along great. I mean, I went down to hung out at his place in Newport. He had the smallest house in Newport Beach. I think Todd Marinovich was raised there. How three people lived there, I don't know, but it was Craig, Todd's mother, and Todd. And here's Craig Fertig. He's sitting on the front veranda, if you will, which is basically the sidewalk, and all the pretty girls in Newport Beach in their bathing suits walking by. And Craig is, hi, Julie. Hi, Diane. Hi, Lorraine. Oh, hi, Craig. How you doing? Everybody knew Craig Fertig. And so give me a Craig Fertig story from hanging out at Julie's and just giving McKay rides home. Pick something out.
I can't pick one out right off the top of my head, but it was just with Fertig, when he saw me, it was instant completion to Sherman, and you know, and how much did that hurt? Are you still remembering that? And you want to bet some more? And yeah, we had. He enjoyed the fact that he could torture me, and he did for many years.
Yeah, I remember I wrote a book called What It Means to Be a Trojan. I interviewed a player who had played for the team when they won a national title under Howard Jones in 1938. And I mentioned that I had just seen this guy. I saw Craig, and I said, yeah, I just came back from, I can't remember his name, Julie or Jules or Barriger, Nate Barriger, I think it was, something like that. And he had been a referee. And he goes, oh yeah, Jules, he's the best referee money can buy. You know, that was Craig.
Yeah.
That was a typical Craig Fertig statement. Okay, so you get out of Notre Dame. What's next for Bill Dwyre?
Got a job at the Des Moines Register and Tribune. It was a great starting newspaper because the Register was a morning newspaper, headquartered, of course, in Des Moines, Iowa, and it had what they call the Peach sheet, Peach, Peach, and it did a great job in sports. I remember sitting on that sports desk on a Friday night, a little hook in front of you, because it was not computerized particularly at that stage. This was 1966, and we would get calls from every high school in the state of Iowa with their football results. And they were all programmed to say, you know, Tommy Jones rushed for 220 yards as Peyton Sheridan High School beat Ames North 26-15. And we had a big roll of paper on our typewriters, and we type it as fast as we could. There were like 10 of us there, all working on the paper that night, on Friday night. And we type it as fast as we could on this roll of carbon paper. And there was somebody who went around, and as soon as we got done, would tear them off and bring them over to the main editor, who would mark it up and send it up a tube. And the next morning, they figured out so that every high school would get its score and its little description of their game in their edition. And Iowa was spread into like 10 different zones. It was the most fascinating newspaper experience I ever had, and they did a wonderful job. And those people who were high school sports fans loved that paper, and it was a great place to learn. I met a lot of good people, and I went from there to the Milwaukee Journal, but I was at the Des Moines Register for, I think, 2.5 years, learning every night.
I'll tell you what, because I've covered high school sports. First of all, I worked in the sports information department at USC, and the calls had come in taking down the times of a USC Cal swim meet up in Berkeley, and a phone call would come in, and I got to write down all these times. And it's important because you write down the wrong time, the family of the person is going to notice it. And then later, when I'm doing high school sports for the Times and also the Daily News, you're in a press box at a high school game, and there was no internet, there was no computer. It was just me and this makeshift scorecard, if you want to call it that. And I got to write down, how many yards, Jim Jones gained, 7 yards for a first down, how many yards the pass was. And then of course you've got to throw in penalties and all these different things. And again, if you say the guy rushed for 103 yards and his family's up in the stands and they've been taking notes and they've got him at 137 yards, you're going to hear about it the next day. So I imagine that's a similar experience that you and I should also mention that when I was with the Times, I was actually writing for the Orange County edition, and I was covering mostly Villa Park games, but I get assigned to, I think it was like they actually had several people, and this was this unbelievable game in 2000. Matt Leinart and Mater Dei versus De La Salle. De La Salle was at about 103 victories straight at the time. And De La Salle had this great winning streak, but they were Northern California, and the Southern section people were saying, well, you don't play the really good teams. You're not playing Mater Dei, not playing Long Beach Poly. So their coach said, okay, we'll play them. And they start scheduling Mater Dei, Long Beach Poly. They're playing teams from Punahou of Hawaii, Everett, Washington, et cetera. This particular game, 37,000 at the Big A, and De La Salle holds on. Leinart leads Mater Dei back, and they get it. They try to kick a game-tying field goal with no overtime, and the guy misses, and the De La Salle winning streak is held. So that was one of my big highlights of being with the LA Times was this magnificent high school game. High school football in Iowa, that's a big deal, Bill. So were you always in the office, or how often were you out in the field?
I was mostly in the office, Stephen. I was hired as a desk guy. You learn copy editing, you learn headline writing, you figure out your grammar. You're a college graduate, but you still are pretty rough around the edges. So I think I wrote a few stories for the Des Moines Register, but mostly I was an inside guy, as we say in the business, and that led to being hired by the Milwaukee Journal. I didn't do much writing. In Milwaukee, I did some writing, quite a bit actually, but in Des Moines, I did not.
Okay, you mentioned something about, you said you put it in a tube, and I remember going to the local newspaper when I was in high school, and they talked about a pneumatic tube is what they said. But you also said that you wrote on this carbon paper. Now, was that carbon paper retyped, or was that imprinted into the paper? How did that work?
It was a roll of carbon paper, and it was in our typewriter. So the roll was on the end, and you just typed it, and as you typed, the paper came up a little bit, and the roll went the other way, and they just tore it off, and then you had more paper to write on. It was just a roll of carbon paper with a main sheet and a sheet that copied it.
But when it got to the editor, did they have to retype it, or was it?
No, they got the original. They got the original, and there was I think the carbon was for record keeping or something, but they would mark up, write a little headline on the original, quick headline, and send it up to Pneumatic Tube. And the carbon, I think, was there to keep track of how many games we had and make sure we got them all.
Okay. Now it's on Wisconsin to Milwaukee, the big city. And you're there when a fellow by the name of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, otherwise known as Ferdinand Louis Alcindor III, son of a New York City transit policeman, a Roman Catholic from Manhattan, arrives from John Wooden and Pauley Pavilion and undefeated seasons to the Milwaukee Bucks, an expansion team. Wow. What a time to be in Milwaukee. Talk about that period.
It was special and painful. They won, I think in his second year, they won the NBA title. They beat the Baltimore Bullets. They were called the Bullets then, 4 straight games. The NBA was not as huge as it is now, so I remember we covered it pretty well, but it was a big deal. And Kareem was just special, and he was so good you couldn't describe it. And he was kind of like every night, all you'd write about was Kareem. And then as it went on, a year or so later, we started to hear that he was unhappy, and we started to get the gist that he was looking to be traded, which was kind of a disaster in Milwaukee. But I've talked to him later about this years later, and he said that there was no cultural landing place for him. He just didn't fit in. And so I was the one that broke the story on Kareem being traded to the Lakers. It was my biggest scoop of my life. Then I remember very, very interestingly, years later when I went to the Los Angeles Times, and the first time I saw him, he said, you moved too. You couldn't handle Milwaukee either. Had nothing to do with anything other than the Milwaukee Journal was a great newspaper, but the Los Angeles Times was a better opportunity. So yeah, he was special. And as our relationship went on in the years later, as I wrote columns about him, and he's written all these books, every time I'd see him, he'd say, make sure you keep writing. Make sure you keep writing. Very important. He's a special person. He's a bright person, somebody that you'd go to if you really needed some really deep advice. I admire him, and I know his health is not great, but I hope he keeps working and keeps writing like he always tells me to do.
I agree with you. He was someone who it took some doing to understand what he was all about. You think of him as taciturn, but he was thoughtful, and he was a seeker. It's interesting. In 70, 71, 72, so this would be 70, 71. And I followed Lou Alcindor like you couldn't believe, because I had followed him all through UCLA and was a big UCLA basketball fan. Followed him with the ball. In fact, I remember Sports Illustrated did a photo of him dunking from behind, which was incredible. And it said, "Look, Ma," I think, "Look, Ma, no hands," or "Look, Ma, 2 hands," or something like that. But so I'm following Jabbar, and I'm reading these box scores of basketball games, right? Or Alcindor. So this is where I'm going with this. And, Alcindor is scoring 30, 34, 35 points per game during this period. So the season starts, the Milwaukee Bucks are playing, and I'm looking at the box score, and I had not yet heard the news that he had converted to Islam and had changed his name. And I'm thinking, boy, where's Alcindor? He must be hurt. What's going on? And then I'm thinking, who's this Jabbar guy? He's scoring 35 points every night. But then I read probably an SI that he had converted and changed his name. And a lot of people didn't understand that. And but like you say, he was a person that you came to admire, because he wasn't. I've always admired intelligence. I would always admire, smart athletes. Now, staying in Milwaukee, did you know Bob Uecker when you were there?
You could not be in any kind of sports media in Milwaukee without knowing Bob Uecker. Yeah, I knew Bob Uecker. He was, I was blessed to know Bob Uecker. Let me put it that way.
My experience, I was in the press box at Phoenix Municipal Stadium with spring training, and I see Bob Uecker. It's before the game, nobody else around. And I go, hi, Bob. My name's Steve Travers. I'm with the San Francisco Examiner, and I'm a big fan. I mean, big fan. And he just goes, hey, thanks, buddy. Just like that. And I mean, as natural and as non-contrived an individual as you could possibly be. I mean, it was like Craig Fertig. Immediately, you're his friend. I mean, that was, I don't know if they were, I would say Fertig and Uecker were exactly alike. Fertig was probably more of a partier and a little more of a robust character, but Uecker was truly a genuine guy. So you got to know him quite well, eh?
Yes, I did.
Excellent. What other memories of Milwaukee in the mid to late 1970s stick out?
Well, I guess I got to be pretty close to Bud Selig. And years later, Selig would come into the press box. I actually walked with him in some of the hallways when he was trying to get a team to come to Milwaukee after the Braves had left. He was part of a group called the Milwaukee Brewers. And he had backing of a lot of the money people in Milwaukee. And I was there in Seattle. Baseball used to treat him badly when he'd go. He'd take his campaign to every meeting they'd have, and it took a couple of years to get a team back to get the Brewers. But I was there in Seattle the night that they came out of the meeting and said, yes, you can acquire the Seattle Pilots. So the Seattle Pilots went to Milwaukee. But Selig, my best memory of Selig, I have many of them, but one of them was that he would come into the press box. He loved sports writers, even though he would never admit it. And he'd sit down next to me, or he'd sit down next to somebody, he'd start talking baseball, and he'd have this big, ugly cigar. And it smelled awful. This was for years he did this. And so I got to writing columns about baseball and the Brewers, and I'd always make some snide remark in the column about Bud Selig's ugly cigar.
Oh, no.
Smelly cigar. And so he quit. He quit smoking, and he told a story at an Associated Press sports editors meeting that I was at when I was with the Los Angeles Times years ago. He had a commissioners meeting, and we had all the sports editors there. It was in New York City, and he said, a lot of you guys are sad that I'm still here. I think this was just after he stopped the All-Star game or something. Bud didn't always do the right things, but he said, a lot of you guys and his sports editors wrote a lot of things about it, had your papers write a lot of things about what I did. And he said, you're probably unhappy that I'm still here. And he said, but there's a guy in this room who's responsible for the fact that I'm still here. You got to blame him. And he said, it's Bill Dwyre from the Los Angeles Times. And everybody looks at me, and Selig says, for years, I enjoyed smoking a big cigar. And I'd come in the press box, and I'd smoke it, and I'd probably blow it in people's faces. And then the next day I'd read in the paper something by Dwyer talking about my ugly, smelly cigar. And my wife finally got sick of it. She said something to the effect of either stop this, I don't want to read about it anymore, or I'll probably walk on you, or something like this. I don't know if it was that extreme, but he said, so I had to stop smoking that cigar. And that's why I'm alive today, and it's his fault.
Okay. So as long as we're assigning fault, sir, I am going to assign fault to you because you arrived in Los Angeles, California to work for the LA Times. And within a short period of time, I've always took the blame for this because I went to USC, and shortly thereafter, Notre Dame beat USC 13 consecutive years. So I'm going to shift the blame from me to you coming to the LA Times. Sir, the Fighting Irish did not lose to the USC Trojans between 1983 and 1996. So
You can imagine how bad I feel about that.
I mean, I'm assuming most of the writers they're not, they might have been UCLA writers, but a lot of them were probably USC, whether in the press box or just in the offices of the LA Times. What were some of the conversations? What was some of the ribbing, some of the jokes? I, for instance, still wear a Notre Dame T-shirt to the gym at least once a week because my good friend Mike McDowd, a great Irishman, made a bet with me a few years ago, and I lost the bet, and now I have to wear this, this green jersey into the gym. So, any similar experiences? Any bets that you made with Murray or any Mal Florence or any of these other guys who were pretty?
Yeah, I can tell you the grand one. This was shortly after I got there, shortly after the paper that I was a Notre Dame guy, and the Irish were into the Coliseum to play that year. I think it was either the first or second year. I think it was the first year I was there. And it's a Friday afternoon, and I'm sitting in my office, just kind of minding my own business. And I hear this sound in the distance, and it's a band. And pretty soon it gets louder and louder. And before I know it, about 8 members of the USC marching band, which I always maintain knew only 2 songs, were standing outside my window. Yeah, until you get a headache. And they were standing outside my glassed-in office playing this song.
Yeah.
And then 2 cheerleaders showed up in their USC uniforms.
That's what they did.
And they presented me with something or other, I don't remember. And standing off to the side with a big smile on his face is Mal Florence.
Right.
Who has concocted this whole thing. And they marched, the LA Times newsroom was huge, as you can remember in the old days. And they marched from the elevators all the way back to the sports section playing this song. And so the whole newspaper was there enjoying me being had. And I was had by Mal Florence.
Yeah, the Trojan band, I've always equated, even though the Trojans are not the Romans, but I've equated them with the Roman Empire, that sort of insinuates their way into foreign lands and plants their flag one way or the other. Just to give you a few examples of things that the Trojans do, like there will be, let's say you're in Marin County and there's what's called a USC send-off, where all the local kids from the local high schools who have chosen to go to USC, it's August, they're just ready to go, and they'll have a send-off, and the local alumni will be there, and there'll be a dinner, and a few people will speak, and the Trojan band will show up. You're in Northern California, or it could be anywhere. They can Las Vegas or wherever it might be, and they'll show up in so-called enemy territory with the cheerleaders, with the music, playing the music, and everyone can hear them. In fact, I was at one of these events, and this guy motions to me and says, "Oh, you're with the Trojans, right?" I go, "Yeah," and he goes, "Yeah, I'm Craig Morton. I used to be a quarterback for the Cal Bears, and Fertig had told me, "Oh yeah, I snaked his girlfriend away from him at the East-West Shrine game." That was a typical Craig Morton type of comment. So let me ask you, Bill, how did you go from Milwaukee? You get immediately hired as the sports editor. Now that's just not.
I was not. I was hired as assistant sports editor. I was the number 2 guy.
Oh, okay.
And I was the night slot man, which means you're in charge of putting out the paper. I was number 2 on the staff. I took kind of a chance because I was sports editor of the Milwaukee Journal. I kind of gambled on this thing, and I didn't know how it was going to work out. But I remember really struggling a little bit because one night we had a tough time trying to figure out how to get all the stories in the paper. We didn't have any space. We always had space problems. So much to do. And I remember looking out at this group of desk people who had been there for years, grizzly veterans, and I said, well, it seemed kind of cloudy outside. Maybe it'll rain, and maybe the Dodgers will be rained out. And there was just silence on the desk. And just they looked at me like, good Lord, what have we got here? One guy finally said, you know, Dwyer, the Dodgers haven't been rained out in 15 years. So I got through that. The sports editor of the LA Times in those days was a man named Bill Shirley. He was older. He had hired me. And 4 months after I got there, he called me in his office and he said, they're going to make you the sports editor. Just give me some time to talk to my people. He was kind of an unpopular guy, but I guess every boss is unpopular. But that's how I got the job. Suddenly, I remember I called my mother in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and we had. She was a newspaper person, and she read it every day. And we had read Jim Murray in the Sentinel every day. He was syndicated in those things. I said, "Oh, Mom, I'm being named sports editor of the Los Angeles Times in a couple of days. It'll be effective Monday." She was very excited. Said, "How nice that is." And I hung up, and then about 2 minutes later, the phone rang again, and she said, "Wait a minute." She said, "Does this mean that you will be Jim Murray's boss?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, I am Jim Murray's boss." And she said, "Oh, God help us." And she hung up the phone. I'll never forget that.
It sounds like when Omar Bradley decides that he's going to get George Patton to take over in Tunisia. And the other guy, one of the other colonels goes, "God help us."
Yeah, exactly.
You know, do you remember,
my mother's reaction.
Yeah. Do you remember a column that Murray wrote? I want to say 82 or 83. I was in school, and it was called it wasn't one of his more famous columns, but I'll tell you why it means something to me. The title of the column was "This Big Horse is a Little Psycho." Does that column? It was about maybe a horse in Santa Anita or Hollywood Park, which he did like to write about. You don't recall that? You don't recall that headline, huh?
No, I don't. I wish I'd written it.
Well, it's a great headline. And the reason I bring it up is I was at SC, and my best friend at SC was a guy named Terry Marks, who played baseball for Rod Dedeaux and later became the president of the Coca-Cola Company. And he read that, and he started calling me Big Horse, just like, and he said, "You're just like the Big Horse, and you're just like him. You're a little bit psycho." And at some point, Big Horse became Horace. And anybody who knew me at USC during that period of time knew me as Horace, not Steve Travers. People to this day goes, "Hey, Horace," you know that. And Terry also said it was from the Horace Clark years. He was from back east. So it somehow morphed into, but that came from a Jim Murray headline. There were some great Murray headlines. Now, you weren't there, but my favorite was along the lines, this was after USC beat Alabama in 1970, and I believe it was Constitution ratified as USC beats Bama. You know, it starts off, the stars and bars were clangling. You know, Old Dixie was shut down yesterday. I mean, he had this magnificent lead. Who wrote those headlines generally? Did Jim come up with them, or did other people?
No. The writers never wrote the headlines. There were a few great headline writers there. One was a guy named Bob Lochner. Another was a guy named Harley Tinkham, who was
oh my God, yeah,
died in the Wool Trojan.
Yes,
I remember one USC Notre Dame football game where USC won in the last second dive into the end zone for a touchdown, except he left the ball on the 2-yard line, but it was in the Coliseum. So
the guy who lived next door to me, his name was Michael. Mike wasn't Jackson. He's a good player. Later played for the Chiefs, and I literally had an LA Times in my hand. I knocked on his door, and I was walking through the threshold. I dropped it on the floor, and he just laughed. But it counted.
Yeah, it was one of those games. But anyway, Harley Tinkham. I came back to the office that day after my school had gotten screwed, and Harley. I said to Harley, do you really like to win like that? He was called the Ace. We call him the Ace. I said, Ace, do you really like to win like that? He said, it's better when we win and we screw you. It's much better.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of headlines. We had a guy named George Casita, who was the backbone of that sports staff in those days. And he was a master headline writer. He had been a sports writer in Philadelphia, a very good one. He covered the NBA. And George set the standard for headline writing for many years at the LA Times. George became my co-Olympic coordinator. When we planned the Olympic coverage at our huge papers that we ran in 1984, George had a lot to do with that. He knew Olympic sports, and he was masterful. He was a troubled guy, but he was masterful, and he set the standard for great headline writing. And they all tried to write headlines that George would approve of.
I have a Ace Tinkham story for you. I don't know if you know this story. It's 1966, and USC is in Austin to play the Texas Longhorns. John Duke Wayne, former USC football player, huge Trojan fan, is in Texas filming The War Wagon with Kirk Douglas, decides to come to Austin for the game. Meets up at a party in the team hotel the night before the game, in a ballroom, and it's big Trojan bash, and everyone's drinking and having a great time. And Wayne is doing some serious drinking. And this is the beginning of the Vietnam War, and Duke Wayne is just going, we're going to go through those communist SOBs like crap through a goose, and we're gonna knock those SOBs, we're gonna knock them back to the Stone Age, And everyone's going, yeah, Duke, that's what we're gonna do, I mean, he's getting ready to do the Green Berets. Harley Ace Tinkham is standing off to the side. He is not a fan of the Vietnam War and not a fan of Duke Wayne. And he finally screws up his courage and walks up to Wayne, and he goes, "Ha, Duke!" Everyone's looking, Duke's friend, guy named his former teammate and frat brother, Gus Pappas. And he's like, he can see Duke's reactions, he can see the bulging of his neck, and he knows he's going to have to do some work here. Some action is going to be taken. And he goes, "Duke, you ain't," and then he says a swear word, "You ain't." And Wayne takes a swing at Harley Tinkham, and Pappas pulls Duke away just enough so the swing just misses Harley. And if it had hit Harley, it probably would have been a major lawsuit, and plus, headlines.
Might have killed him.
It might have killed him. And then just as this happens, just as before this happened, Marv Gu had entered the ballroom, and he sees it, and he also hears Duke Wayne talking about what they're going to do to the communists in Vietnam. And he's so impressed that he changes his pregame speech from Kirk Douglas's speech in Spartacus from 1960 to what Duke Wayne said in that ballroom. And 4 years later, it was repeated verbatim in the movie Patton. And I speculated in a book I wrote about Duke Wayne that John Milius, who wrote Apocalypse Now, was snuck into one of these speeches that Gu made at Heritage Hall by Ron Schwery, who was the student manager, and later he was his friend in Hollywood who won 2 Oscars for movies. And that Milius picked it up and gave it to Francis Ford Coppola, who used it in the beginning of Pat. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But it started. I knew Ace's daughter at USC, so I was able to get a little background on that.
Yeah, he was quite a character.
Yeah, I didn't know him personally. She sent me some photos of him on the SC campus, I think, during graduation. It might have been my graduation too.
Remember the days when we ran morning briefing every morning?
Yeah, and who was that guy who came up with who was doing that? It was brilliant.
Ace.
That was Ace started that, and then someone else picked up on it later.
Well, Malamud did it for a while.
Alan Malamud, yeah.
Before he died, yeah.
Yeah. So that was Ace's Ace in the hole, if you will, for a
Yes, it
long
was.
time.
Yes, it was, exactly.
And he was also big on track and Olympic sports.
Yeah, he was an expert on that. When we had the Olympics, he did much of the copy editing on all track and field coverage.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get to two monumental figures of the LA Times, and you're there. Otis Chandler and Jim Murray. And Otis, of course, he hired you, even though
Yes.
Shirley hired you, but I'm sure it had to be approved by Otis Chandler. By the time you got there, his reputation was secure, but it took a while for him to get past, he's a blonde-haired playboy, surfer boy, who went to Stanford. But he made his bona fides. He hired Murray. What was it like to work with those two characters? I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking, but tell me tell me what was going on, these two monumental figures of American journalism.
Well, I mean, they were monumental figures. Otis, we had a gymnasium in the bottom floor of the Times, and I was younger and trying to stay in shape, and I would go down there a couple of times a week. And Otis was always lifting weights. Every day he went down there and lifted weights. He was an Olympic level shot putter, if you remember. Yeah. And I think in 1960 he got sick on the day of the trials and just missed the team that went to probably Tokyo, I think, in 1960.
I think it was Helsinki.
Maybe it was. Okay. He just missed by a little bit, but he loved the Olympics. And so as soon as I got there, just about every time I saw him, he didn't pressure me, but he'd check in and say, how is the Olympic planning going? And I knew very clearly that this was a big, important time for him. And he spared no expense, and we spent a lot of money to cover it like we did, and we covered it pretty well.
Yeah, sure.
And he loved Murray. He was responsible for getting Murray away from, I think it was Time or Life magazine,
right?
When they hired him, and he and Murray got along very well, and Otis was just kind of, when I got there, he was pretty much a regular guy. I had one situation with him I'll never forget. I got to LA and I was driving to work. My second car was a little Ford Pinto, worst car in the world.
Oh my God. Terrible.
Yeah, terrible car. And so one day I'm sitting at my desk, and the phone rings at my desk, and it's Otis Chandler. And he says, are you going to the fight? They have a showing of the fight in Century City. It was a heavyweight fight. I don't remember who it was, but it was a big fight. And I said, yeah, I planned to go. And he said, could I go along with you? I said, sure. He said, I'm going to go home early. Pick me up at such and such an address, one of the richer parts of Los Angeles. I don't remember exactly where it was. So I said, sure, I'll pick you up. So unfortunately, I had my Pinto.
Yeah.
And so I drove my Pinto to Otis's house and knocked on the door, and he came out, and everything was fine, except that when I got back in the Pinto, it wouldn't start. And now I'm so embarrassed I can't even think straight. And I thought, well, I better call somebody quickly. And Otis wants to get to this place in Century City where they're having a TV viewing of this fight. we want to get there in time. And Otis says, no, just pop the hood. So I pop the hood, and Otis Chandler gets under the hood and starts the car, fixes it, starts the car. And I was so embarrassed, but we go out to Century City and we pulled in and valet parked it, and I didn't turn it off. And we went, saw it, came back out, got the car ordered to come back around, and valet parker pulled it up and shut it off. Oh my God, it went off again, it wouldn't start. Otis says, pop the hood again. Jeez. So I pop the hood, he gets underneath and starts the car. I can't even describe, Stephen, how embarrassed I am. And he gets in the car, doesn't say much, and off we go, and I deliver him home to Bel Air, wherever it was, and I drive in the driveway, and he says, I'll just pop out of here. I'll just leave the car running. And I did, and I got home, and I'll never forget that. He was so kind to me with he popped that hood and started that car twice. I got rid of the car shortly thereafter, I think.
The LA during this period, if the Sunday Times was about a 400-page document. I mean, I can just remember, just for instance, an article by a guy named Tom Bonk, who was a kind of golf writer, but he would give him feature assignments. And he writes this long piece about Bill Spaceman Lee. And I remember reading it, and I didn't know Bill, but I knew of him. And I ended up calling Tom Bonk, and somehow through that call, I ended up getting in touch with Bill Lee. And I invited Bill to speak at an event down in Costa Mesa. And Bill and I are friends to this very day. And in fact, Bill is the neighbor of my daughter living in Vermont. But these articles, they'd start on the first page. It would be just maybe this much space on the first page. Then we'd go continue to page 13.
and then 14, and then 15,
all of page 13 and all of page 14 of the large newspaper would be the continuation of this art. Then it would go continue to page 15. See Spaceman in Canada, page 15, And it was like small novels and small books. And that.
You remember the story, Stephen, about, I never was sure if it was true, but the paper got to be so big and heavy that allegedly one time when one of the paper distributors were throwing the paper on a porch or something, they hit a Yorkshire Terrier and killed it.
I'm not surprised.
Broke its neck.
It was
never been able to establish whether that's true, but that was the story.
Well, I mean, I had a whole routine on Sunday. You get the paper and you would lay it out, and I would separate the news from the advertisements, because the advertisements were an enormous part. This was before the internet. And of course, advertising in the Times was probably the biggest way to advertise in Los Angeles at that time. He separated all the advertisements and the want ads, and then you got the news, and you put, and I'd spend 2 hours on a Sunday. I'd get up early and just read, and it was like, well, I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I'd end up reading almost every article because it was like it would grip me so much. That's how good it was. That's how good the writers were. So speaking of great writers, you're there with Murray. Now, you're there with Jim Murray during some very difficult times in his life. He goes blind. He loses his son to drug overdose. He loses his wife. So how well did you know him? How privy were you to these tragedies in his life? Did he talk to you about it? Tell me about this period of time. I think we're going to say roughly 82 to 86. A lot of these things were happening.
Yes. I remember I had to make the call. Somebody called me and told me that he lost his son. His son had died, and I had to find him. And I guess I found him in Las Vegas, so I was the one that told him about that, and that wasn't easy. And then, of course, we all remember when Jerry, his wife, died. He wrote this fantastic column about.
Yeah.
This is a column I never wanted to write. Yeah. This is.
I lost my best friend.
Yeah, I lost my best, and that came across. He wrote for Tuesday, and Jerry had died on a Saturday or Sunday. They were in Palm Springs, and I had no expectation that he would write. And on a Monday afternoon, we had computers where every time somebody filed a story, it would flash across the top of the screen saying it had arrived. And I'm looking, and there's a Jim Murray column flashing across the screen. What is he doing? He's not writing. Jerry just died. And I open it up, and it was like one person could open it up and copy it, but all the other people on the staff could also see that it was filed, and they could open it up and read it. They couldn't touch it. Right. So at the same time I'm opening it up, the whole staff is opening it up, seeing this, having the same reaction I am, and seeing this. And I finally stood up, and I walked out into the sports department, which was huge in those days, and there are guys just sobbing. It was such an amazing thing. So I'll never forget that. He needed to say it, and he needed to say it right away, and he said it beautifully. Yeah, I lived through the whole thing with his funeral, and I remember his memorial service. Walking out after it was over, I was one of the pallbearers, and walking out after it was over onto this kind of entryway, big balcony out in front of the church. And there's standing Mike Tyson.
Right.
This is very strange because Murray destroyed Mike Tyson in every column he ever wrote about him. And so I kind of walked up to Mike Tyson and I introduced myself. And Tyson was just in tears. He said, he was such a fine man. He had this little squeaky voice. Yeah. Such a fine man. And I feel so bad that I had to come. And it was quite a time. I remember going up with the burial site after that, and standing near the grave, up on a kind of a hill overlooking the 405 freeway where he's buried. And one of his friends wandered up to me and he said, Jim would hate this spot. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's a side hill lie. He always hated side hill lies. And the golf, Jim Murray was always there. So I remember so many stories, and it was tough to lose him. And we wrote, I think you showed a paper earlier in the day when his 10-year anniversary of his death. We had a whole section on it. I remember columns from guys like Mike Downey, who's also gone now. Yeah. His reaction was, "Dear Jim Murray, if you think that the rest of us, we columnists, are going to just stand around and just let you think that you're better than all of us and everything you write is better than all of us, well, you're right." So yeah, a lot of emotional time in those days, and when Murray was gone, it took a lot of soul out of the newspaper and the sports staff.
Well, there's so many thoughts go through my head when you bring that up, because it was 1998. Jim Murray passes away. There was a great book, I believe it was called Privileged Son. It was a story about Otis Chandler in the Times, and it was later made into a really good PBS documentary about the relationship of the Chandler family to the city of Los Angeles. And I include Jim Murray and Vin Scully and a few people who just stand above the city like a colossus in terms of their input and their relationship. But I remember there was a lot of things going on in the 90s up until leading up to the death of Murray, and then right after the death of Murray, and then horrors of the sale of the paper to the Chicago Tribune. But you were quoted, I believe it was in Privileged Son, of Otis Chandler coming back. And you were saying it's like Patton returning. Do you remember that quote?
Yeah, I think I probably said that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we'll talk a little bit about this period of time where Otis kind of steps down and the paper is struggling with the internet and it's with the new landscape of newspapers in the 90s. And then Chandler comes back, and then slowly but surely the paper really starts to lose a lot of its mojo. And so that had to hurt.
Yeah, it was declining, but I'm not sure that it was doing anything other than the whole business was declining. It was the internet was upon us, and we were trying to deal with it. And, we weren't surprised by it, but we were taken over by it slowly but surely. I could see it coming. I wanted to fight it. We did for a while, and successfully for a while. But Otis came back. We had a situation with Staples Center, if you remember correctly.
Oh yeah.
I was in the middle of that. One of my assistant sports editors, a guy named Rick Jaffe, and I decided that with the opening of Staples Center, which is what, 2000? 1999, 2000?
Yeah, I think it was 99, 2000 season.
Something like that. And we decided that we would need to have a special section on that. And so we started planning a special section, and we're hoping we'd sell it. It's hard to sell those special sections, and we planned a lot of stories. And one day, somebody came in, one of the higher ups came into my office and said, we got to have some more stories because we're going to transfer this to the Sunday magazine rather than have it in the sports section, the Sunday LA Times magazine. And so we're going to need to have some more stories to help fill this. Well, I was stunned because this was at a stage where we didn't sell much of anything. And to have somebody say to me, we're selling this so much that we need more stories. Well, I wasn't quite sure, but we assigned some more stories, and we got this thing filled, and it was in this massive Sunday magazine section. And I never felt good about it, but I didn't know what was going on. And maybe a month later or so, one of my assistants came in and said that somebody from our marketing department or our accounting department had called and said that he wanted to have the list of our expenses because we're sharing the expenses of putting out this magazine with Staples Center. And it just knocked me on my back because we don't share expenses with news sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so this began the whole thing. I remember the editor walking by, and it took me a long time to figure out how many people had known about this and how many hadn't. And unfortunately, some of the people in the front office after Otis was gone didn't quite understand the enormity of what would happen in this, and it did happen. It destroyed the paper, and the New York Times came in and made fun of us, and pretty soon we were sold, and it was a bad thing. But Otis did come back for part of that and express his dislike and express his amazement that it would happen. But he was so far gone at that stage that he couldn't do anything about it. And that was the beginning of the end. Staples Center.
I had a similar experience that I was involved in when I guess you call newspaper ethics. In 2002, I wrote a book called Barry Bonds, Baseball Superman, all about Barry Bonds. And the San Francisco Chronicle was not reviewing the book. It was getting a lot of play. It was on ESPN. It was on CNN. It was on USA Today. It sold well, but the newspaper was not. So I finally, someone in the, I think it was one of the radio guys, said that the reason they weren't reviewing my book was because they had a deal with the the Giants had a deal with the San Francisco Chronicle, a partnership of the stadium with the Chronicle of some kind. They were in bed together. They were in business together, just like the Times doing something with Staples Center. And at the time, there was this belief that my book would not be favorable to bonds, which it actually was favorable to bonds. It was just honest about bonds. It was not I wasn't, kowtowing to Barry Bonds. And a writer that I know because he was with the LA Times and he was a person of great respect, and that was Dwight Chapin. And he was with the Chronicle, and he went against whatever mandate might have been out and wrote a review of my Barry Bonds book. And it was a good, solid review. It didn't say it's the greatest book of all time, but it was an honest assessment of what I had written. But that was what was happening at that time. But I want to. And I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to say this about you, Bill. You were part of a golden age of journalism, and not just sports journalism. First of all, you come along during what's known as new journalism. This is in the late 1960s, early 70s, a period of time where a lot of really interesting writers like Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson and Gay Talese and one of my all-time favorites, Pat Jordan, are writing books and novels and stories that include themselves. And it was also an era of the great sports novel, Semi-Tough by Dan Jenkins, North Dallas 40, and Pat Jordan's books, which were about his minor league career, which was a big inspiration to me. And of course, Jim Murray. And there were so many great. Red Smith, I think, was still around during this period of time, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure.
Yes, he was.
And there were some great writers at the New York Times. And in my humble opinion, by the time Murray won the Pulitzer Prize, which I believe was in 1970, I felt that the LA Times had surpassed the New York Times or the London Times or any other newspaper you want to talk about, being the greatest newspaper in the world at that particular point. And you were part of it, and you have to be proud of that. So what say you?
Well, I am proud of it. His Pulitzer was in 1989 or 1990, not 1970.
Yeah.
And I still watch with great amazement to what happening to papers. I mean, the circulation numbers are frightening. In the heydays of the late 80s and early 1990s, we would circulate 1.5 million on Sunday and 1.2 million on weekdays, and now it's barely 100,000, and I'm just baffled by that. The only thing I can think of, Stephen, is that to comment on that is that I have found that in all newspapers, including the LA Times, there is not enough understanding of the value of marketing value and sales value of a great sports section.
Hear, hear.
Newspapers the LA Times does great work in many areas, great investigative reporting, but you're publishing something in a city with the Lakers and the Dodgers and the Angels and USC and UCLA and the Clippers, and so much is there, and so many people build their lives around that, not out of control, but that's what they do. They go to Dodger games. They have season tickets. They care about the Bruins. They care about the Trojans. And you can run a newspaper and create a circulation by paying attention to them. And you don't have to fawn over them. You don't have to give everything up to them. But you need to, in a city like LA, pay attention to the sports section and the sports writers and the abilities that those writers the marketing abilities that those writers can bring to that paper, and the image building that they can make. There was no better image than Jim Murray.
That is
number of people who bought that paper because of him.
Jim Murray created an image of Southern California. Okay,
Right.
whether it was the Rose Bowl or the sun. The sun was rose out over the green plains of the Rose Bowl before the New Year's Day. The Trojans playing the Michigan Wolverines, and he would give you color of the city. Now, there was an article. It wasn't a Jim Murray article, although Murray's were just as good as any of them. But there was an article came out in Sports Illustrated in 1972 by a friend of mine, who's now a friend, named Pat Jordan, who was a great writer for SI and wrote some great sports books. And it was about a baseball player named Bo Belinsky who played for the Los Angeles Angels. And he finds Belinsky living in a house in the Hollywood Hills in 1972. And he's drunk and he's out of baseball, and he's a Bob Seger song, A Beautiful Loser. And he writes the greatest human interest story I've ever seen. And it gives you a picture of Los Angeles, the Sunset Boulevard, the Hollywood Hills, and it describes baseball and LA in a way that was utterly and absolutely intoxicating. And Murray did this, and you were his editor. And did you ever have to pull him back? Did you ever have to urge him to do more? What was your main job as the editor when you've got a talent like that?
Make sure he's happy.
Right.
Make sure he went where he wanted to go and did not have to go where he did not want to go. I had to keep in mind his health situation and not push him too hard, and once in a while just kind of feed an idea to him, see if it rang a bell with him. But that was all. You weren't Jim Murray's boss. You were his companion and fellow worker.
Okay, so last question. We're talking about cities, and this was another one. Jim Murray used to write about cities. No one does this anymore. Now we live in a world of wokeness and safe spaces, and nobody says anything about anything. Jim Murray would write about cities. Let me see. San Francisco was a no-host bar. Cincinnati existed because Kentucky had lent them their farm equipment.
No, it was Cincinnati couldn't finish the stadium because Kentucky still had the cement mixer or something.
Yes, they still had the cement. They hadn't given the cement mixer back to finish, the making of Riverfront Stadium or something. And it was on and on. It was Salt Lake City, of course. Best thing about going to Pullman is leaving. The best thing about Salt Lake City is the Denny's at 5 o'clock or whatever it might be. Talk a little bit about Jim Murray and cities. Did he talk about, where did some of these ideas come from? Was it strictly just traveling around?
Yeah, he loved Los Angeles, and he loved the image. And he said one time, he told me that he'd go to a city for a ball game or something on a regular assignment, and he'd be bored very quickly, and he could see that it was tough to be there. And he said you could leave them alone, or you could nudge them a little bit, poke fun at them a little bit, and see what they're made of. And he chose the poking fun at, as you would know he would. It wasn't, for most guys that would be a gimmick, but for Murray, it was just another expression of great writing and how he could do it. So it was just something he did, and he loved to do it. And when something hit him as he walked into a city or got off the plane or something, he'd go with it, and he did.
I think there were even mayors who wrote letters to the Times saying, "I'm proud to have Jim Murray, make fun of us." it puts us on the map,
Yeah, that's true. Just spell my name right. Write about me and just spell my name right. The old.
Yeah, well, that's true. I'll make one last observation of Murray. This is from his youth, and I got this from my research. And I compare it to Francis Ford Coppola because they're both artists in different ways, but they both had a similar experience when they were young people. Coppola living in New York, Murray living in Connecticut. Murray, when he was about 7, young, might have been a little older, he got sick. And he was bedridden for the better part of a year. And Francis Ford Coppola had a similar situation. Something happened and he was bedridden for a long period of time. And during this period of time, both men read voraciously and they wrote voraciously. Murray wrote letters to, I'm getting his name wrong, Eamon de Calera, Prime Minister of the Free State of Ireland, which was a big deal to him being Irish, because they were, I think in 1920, they split from Northern Ireland. Wrote a letter to him. And he would write letters to presidents and movie studios and newspapers and writers. And he would read everything and poets and not just sports. And the same thing with Coppola. And they both became just people of such creative genius, right? I think Jim Murray could have been a great screenwriter. Do you think he wrote with, I call it cinematic flair, like almost like think of it as being a movie moment? Does that make any sense to you?
I think that when you're a sports columnist, and I lived this for a while, you don't really think about anything other than what's in front of you and how you can, the game or the person or the result or the controversy. If you're good at it, you eliminate all that other stuff.
Yeah.
You just focus on how you can write that in the most creative way, because you're thinking in terms of 750 to 900 words. That limits you. You can't wander. You have to get to the point. Yeah. And the whole writing a sports column is a real art.
Sure is.
Murray was a master of it. He was the Picasso of the sports column, and will always be in my mind that same thing.
Well, sir, I want to thank you so much for sharing your memories and thoughts and passions on Take 5 with Steven Travers. We talked about the LA Times, which is a special place in my heart, and Jim Murray with a very special place in my heart. But you do too, You were a guy who was in charge of a great newspaper, during a period of time when I was coming up and was a writer. And, it's funny, we talk about, what has happened to newspapers, and look at what we're doing today. We're on a podcast / YouTube show. Although I am still writing I'm Substacking, or I'm writing blogs for Substack, and I'm actually working on a new book. So I haven't completely given up, but yeah, it's changed drastically and not for the better, but you were part of the better. As far as I'm concerned, you're up there with Jim Murray, Hunter Thompson, Pat Jordan, Dan Jenkins, Bruce Jenkins, Scott Ostler, some of my favorite writers, some of my favorite people. And you're part of the city of Los Angeles, which played such an enormous role in my life. And I want to thank you so much for doing that and for being my guest today. And God bless you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's very kind of you to say that. And I enjoyed it. I appreciated you asking me to come on. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thanks so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Take 5 with Steven Travers is concluded for another episode, and pick us up next week. I think we're going to have my old friend Terry Marks, former president of the Coca-Cola Company, talking about sports marketing. So off we go and fight on for USC.